Okay, now what we're going to do is take a look at the impact of deficits on expansionary fiscal policy and how government deals with those deficits. So, again, the focus of an expansionary fiscal policy is to increase aggregate demand, and they will do that by decreasing taxes or increasing government spending. So, if you are collecting less, spending more, this is going to lead to a deficit when it comes to your budget. Now, how government approaches this deficit um, will have an impact on the overall expansionary fiscal policy. The critical graph, there's two graphs that we can use actually, and government has two options. It can borrow from the public, and this one is going to be actually anti-expansionary. So this is going to actually have some contractionary impact. And in many cases, this is what we would consider crowding out. When the government chooses to borrow from the public, because it's going to crowd out the public uh, purchases, public savers or borrowers, and lead to an increase in interest rates. Or it can resort to money creation, and this is actually, if I can use this term, extra expansionary. So let's see what happens here when government chooses policy option number one. The important graph we want is a loanable funds graph. Here is the supply of loanable funds, which comes from savers, and then we have the demand for loanable funds, which comes from borrowers. We have interest rates over here, and we have our quantity of loanable funds down here. So we have interest rates, and this is the loanable funds graph. Another graph that we can use is a money market graph. We have the supply of money, we have the demand for money down here. Is the quantity, I'm running out of space. Over here, interest rates, and the intersection of supply and demand for money sets interest rates. So this graph here is a money market graph. So we can use either a loanable funds graph or a money market graph, and then we need an investment graph. And the investment graph, you just have a downward sloping demand curve for investment. Here's the quantity of investment, and the intersection, the supply of interest rates are on this axis. And so at that level of interest rates, here is our level of investment. So now, let me change colors real quick. If government is going to be an additional borrower because it's running deficits, that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. And when the demand for loanable funds increases, we get an increase in interest rates. When interest rates rise, the level of investment decreases. And again, investment is a component of aggregate demand. So this then impacts our aggregate supply and demand graph. So I go back here Here's our short run aggregate supply. Here's our aggregate demand. Over here is our price level. Here is current output, current price level. Over here, real GDP, employment. Now the purpose of the expansionary policy was to increase aggregate demand. So we wanted to shift aggregate demand to the right and achieve our level of full employment at the price level and that employment. But now, if we go back here, since the government is running a deficit to achieve this, it increased the demand for loanable funds, which then led to a rise in interest rates, which led to a decrease in the quantity of investment. When that happens, if investment declines, then aggregate demand decreases. And so you end up with a situation like this, and an equilibrium here where we don't reach full employment and we don't reach the targeted price level. So this is the problem. We don't achieve what we originally wanted. And this is what we would call crowding out. Because the impact here that what government did is they crowded out the private investors. One other way to describe this situation instead of using a loanable funds graph is that you could also use a money market graph. And in this case, when the government runs a deficit and borrows from the public, it's actually increasing the demand for money. And so when the demand for money increases, you can see that interest rates rise. And so you have the same effect here on the investment graph, which would have the same effect on an aggregate demand graph. Aggregate demand would actually decrease and it would be contractionary. The money creation, you don't end up with this crowding out because here I'll use a money market graph since we're creating money. Here is interest rates, here's our quantity of money, and this is option number 2. If this occurs and let me go with a different color here, green. If we increase the supply of money through money creation, you can see the effect that this is going to have. The supply of money increases and interest rates drop. And so when interest rates drop, if I go back up here, what happens? Our investment increases. Actually, I should have made that a 2. So the level of investment increases. So if we choose money creation, instead of going back to this pink line, actually it's going to push aggregate demand out here even further. And we actually may perhaps overshooting and resulting in inflation. So that's the impact of the deficit on expansionary fiscal policy. How government approaches these will have different outcomes. Borrowing from the public will be somewhat anti-expansionary. So in short, it's contractionary. And the money creation is actually a little extra expansionary, which could lead to inflation. So now, next topic, I'll focus on the impact of surpluses on contractionary policy.